we're talking today to Kate Hudson, who's General Secretary of the National Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and we're going to talk about CND's Wash Our Hands of Trident campaign. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks very much, Jacqui. Nice to be with you.
Thank you. I'll just give people a little bit of information about you so they know who they're listening to today. Kate has been General Secretary of National CND since 2010, and before that Kate was the Chair of CND for about 7 years. Kate, is that about right?
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Great. And Kate's been a leading anti-nuclear, peace, social justice campaigner for many, many years, both nationally and internationally. Yes, that's right, isn't it?
It's kept me busy.
Yes, I bet. Okay, so in these straitened times that we're all living through, we thought it would be really good to be able to talk to people about the national crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, and where CND stands on this issue, and why we're asking the UK government to wash its hands of Trident. So I'm going to ask Kate questions, and then we're going to take it from there. So Kate, please would you give us some information about the campaign?
Well, your listeners may know that for many years CND's campaign for the NHS, not Trident, we've argued that money, our collective national money, our resources should be put into meeting the needs of the people, and the health service is something that resonates with all of us. We've also seen that over the last 10 years at least, the NHS has been chronically underfunded. So we've got a situation now, the onset of the pandemic, thousands of people are affected, tens of thousands are affected, thousands have very sadly died, some in very terrible circumstances. We see the pictures on the telly and on social media of the nurses, the doctors, all the health workers, but other frontline workers as well, like bus drivers and so on, really suffering and just doing their very best, but with completely inadequate resources. You know, we are one of the wealthiest countries in the world, but we've got a situation where we potentially don't have enough ventilators, people aren't having enough personal protective equipment, and so on. We all know what the situation is. Now, in my view, if no one had ever had any concerns about there being pandemics, you know, this was completely out of the blue, then maybe it would be understandable that we weren't ready and equipped for it. But the fact is, if you look at national security strategies for at least 15 years, the whole of this century, you can see that the experts have identified the danger of pandemics, public health emergencies, as a tier 1 threat to our national security. Now, if the experts have got it there in the strategy, the government will have seen it, they will have endorsed it. So why, if this has been identified as that level of risk, how is it that the government hasn't put the money in? How is it that we've just been caught short on every front? And our opinion from CND is you don't really have to look very far to find out at least part of the reason. If you go on looking through the risk assessment in the security strategy, tier 1 includes pandemics. You go down to tier 2, and that includes state-on-state nuclear weapons threat. That's Trident, you know, the Trident nuclear weapons system. So why is it that we know that a tier 2 threat is getting £205 billion to upgrade over the next few years? The tier 1 pandemic threat, it's just not funded. You know, we're just not having that funding put into it. So this seems to us that, I mean, the nicest way of putting it is that it's not joined up thinking on the part of the government. Perhaps the more accurate way is to say that it's criminally negligent to ignore the needs of the country, of the population, in terms of a pandemic, and to spend all that money on nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction. Absolutely. So that's why we say we've got to speak to the government, we've got to lobby our MPs and say, government, wash your hands of Trident. It's not meeting any of our needs. People are dying. That money has to be reassigned.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that works out to, that 205 billion works out to round about, is it about 7 billion a year that's been spent on Trident? And there have been some figures that have been out there that I've seen on Facebook, I think, posted by the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, of just how that 7 billion could be spent. Because I think it's always useful, isn't it, to be able to look at a figure and equate it to the socially productive way it could be spent. So are you able to give us an idea of how that, what that would equate to, especially during the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis?
Yeah. Well, when you start looking at how much stuff you could buy for that amount of money, I mean, it just becomes mind-boggling. So you look at ventilators, very technical pieces of kit, you know, highly sophisticated. The cost of a ventilator, you know, different models, runs from, say, £20,000 to £50,000. So your basic category, £20,000. For £2 million, this is where my sums make, no, for £20 million, you can have 1,000 ventilators. Someone's going to phone in and say my maths is wrong. But you see what I mean? But just a tiny proportion of what is spent every year just on keeping the existing system going, never mind building a new one, you could more than fulfill all our needs. And when you think about the masks, you know, the little surgical masks, you could probably get, you know, wholesale, a couple or more for £1. You know, so it's like, we're not talking about massive amounts of money that, you know, the government hasn't got. We're talking about relatively small amounts of money to meet those needs. And when you compare it to the scale of spending on nuclear weapons, it barely touches it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And when we've seen, I mean, I know that they've changed their mind, but when we see the Excel Centre being kitted out, the Excel Centre that belongs to Saudi Arabia, I believe, the Excel Centre has been kitted out, and before they changed their minds, we were looking at at masses, millions and millions of pounds for the hire of that space. When if that space, if more hospitals had been built and kitted out in the first place, then we wouldn't have been looking at that. I mean, luckily, people power seemed to have worked, and they've pulled back on that. And I'm assuming now that means that that the Excel Centre is being given to the NHS for use. And as you said, Kate, speaking about the campaigning and how people can get involved, that was something very, very simple that people did, that, you know, which was shining a light on that issue.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that strikes me, and of course we've seen the Nightingale hospitals being developed elsewhere. I think you've got one coming on stream in Manchester as well. It's amazing just how quickly things can actually be done. You know, so you can go for years with the government saying, sorry, we haven't got the money, or no, that's a utopian fantasy, that would never work. Suddenly, they find the money, they get the resources, and they do things quickly. You know, so you know, in terms of things like arms conversion, which has been a big issue, a big debate throughout this crisis, and now we've got a situation where Babcock, which is one of the defence or arms producers, you know, that is involved with the nuclear weapons production, they have now accepted an order to build 10,000 ventilators from the government, you know. So suddenly that can be done, having been told we were kind of maniacs for years for thinking about such a thing. Now they can do it. But why, knowing that, you know, there's a likelihood of this great emergency taking place, why didn't they do it before? You know, why didn't they have some kind of conversion of this kind of production ready, you know, so that when this was hitting us, we had those ventilators ready. You know, they shouldn't leave these things unplanned and uncatered for. And I'm hoping that one of the things that will come out of this terrible, terrible, tragic crisis is we'll be thinking about ways to plan for and provide for the population.
Absolutely, and we've even heard think about, you know, this blue sky thinking that we used to hear about quite a lot. Blue sky thinking would have been in the past a consortium of these multi-billion dollar industries actually working together on a solution, and now. And we were told that that was very much pie in the sky sort of conversation to be had. And we're looking at a possible consortium of Rolls-Royce, BAE Systems, Babcock. You know, these are the sort of conversations that we imagined, or we imagined would never happen because there wasn't the will. But suddenly now there is the will, and as you say, it just shows what can be done when it's a crisis situation. And these things have to be remembered, don't they, at the end of this?
Well, you've touched on it, I think, when you talk about political will. You know, that's what it is. You know, the resources are there. We're a very wealthy society. It's a question of what the priorities are. And for a long time, I think the odds of the government, the agenda that's pursued at the top levels, is really at odds with what ordinary people want and need.
It is, and it shows us way back in the 80s, when we were looking at the steel industry and the coal industry being decimated, and communities being completely decimated because the focus was very much on one particular job. One particular industry that everybody, the communities were all focused on. And again, we've been talking, CND has been talking for many years about diversification, and we were told that it just wasn't possible. But now again, this has shone a light on just how possible that is, and how wonderful would that be to have diversification within these communities that would give them a protection from any bust of their industry in their areas, in their regions. It just seems to make absolute and perfect sense. It always has to us, but hopefully it will make sense within those communities and within Parliament.
Yeah. Well, I think we've seen things change so rapidly in such a short period of time that it must make people think, well, actually, it is possible to do things differently. I mean, how many times have we heard over the years and over the decades, oh, well, there's nothing we can do about it. You know, we'd like things to be different. It's just going to carry on the same. This is how it is. But suddenly, in the space of just a few weeks, homeless people have been housed. You know, ideally, they should have their own homes and so on, you know, but the fact that they can be taken off the streets and put into hotels, you know, that shows that it is possible to do something. Homeless people living on the streets is not a fact of life that we have to accept. It's a fact of how things have been run. And I think we all have to stand up after this and say, actually, there is no going back to that sort of process. In fact, I heard a Liverpool councillor on the news saying that very thing just a few days ago, you know, about the homelessness problem there in Liverpool. You know, it's not possible that people can just be turfed out when this is over and kicked out back to go and live on the streets. It's just not acceptable in such a wealthy society as ours. Not acceptable in any society, in fact.
No, absolutely. So what we're looking at, I think, in a lot of ways, is that wonderful magic money tree bearing fruit, aren't we? That tree that we were told that doesn't exist, and suddenly it exists. I mean, obviously, we're going to be at a point at the other end of this where this money's got to be found from somewhere. We're assuming that money is being lent. It's been borrowed. It's been borrowed from somewhere. We don't know where that is, but it does appear that it actually possibly does exist. which is very interesting.
Mm. Well, yes, I mean, I suppose I've always said, you know, there's actually plenty of money out there. It's just a question of distribution, you know, when we know that like a tiny number of people at the top of society own as much wealth as like the bottom 30 or 40% or something, you know, so there is money, you know, it's a question of what it's spent on, you know, and what the priorities are. So you'd have to, you know, and there's a big debate that's been going on for years now about, well, you know, it's actually, it's more beneficial to society to borrow, to invest, to produce, to add value, to have money going around, goods going around, people able to buy things, people able to work because there's investment being made, and then that takes you forward, you know, and you're not just some kind of dead end thing with loads of debt. You're a prosperous, developing, building society going forward. If you've got debts to pay, then you can pay them because there's a kind of a growth. There's a growth in the economy. If you have growth in the economy, then that's beneficial to everybody, particularly if the profits of the growth aren't just going to the people at the top. You have to have a fair system. You know, it always used to be called the social wage that people had, you know, through taxation and all those types of things. You would have access to good schools, swimming pools, libraries, health, all those kinds of things which have been eroded and taken away from people. And there has to be a reversal of that. You know, society and the economy have to be organised differently. You know, that is just the fact. It has to be organised differently. And I hope very much that one thing that people will take out of this is that planning is a good idea. You know, planning the idea of planning was trashed by Margaret Thatcher and ever since. But what is our government doing now? But planning to meet the needs of the people, whether it's the homeless, whether it's the vulnerable, you know, things like food, you know, the kind of throughput of food so everyone can be fed and all those kinds of things, planning for the hospitals and so on. So planning has an important role in society to meet needs, you know, and also state ownership, you know, public ownership of things like hospitals and so on. We've had a situation where the government has had to pay to use private hospital beds. You know, now that doesn't seem to me to be, you know, the right kind of thing. You know, we need to have enough in the public provision for everybody, you know, free of charge. That's the great glory of the public health service. You know, that's how it has to be. So I'm hoping that people will take those lessons and realise it's not an inevitability that some people are incredibly poor and some people are incredibly rich. It just means that policies are being done wrong.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the beginning of that could be that that government, not just the UK government, that governments around the world will take a good, long, hard look at the budgeting and the spend on weapons of mass destruction, like the Trident nuclear weapons system, and hopefully people will realise that as well, that the people out there will realise that. And I think that's obviously CND's job, that's our job, part of our job, to be out there and to be talking about this issue, which is what we're doing today. So could you it's really great talking to you and really great talking to you about this issue. What can people do? What can people that want to make sure they hold the government and future governments to account, and literally make them put the money where the mouth is? What can they physically do, apart from, of course, you're going to say, which I would say as well, of course you're going to say join CND. That absolutely goes without saying. We would recommend that everybody does that. What else could they do? What other positive things could they do?
So a very simple one. If you go on the CND website, there's a link there. You can just click on it and it will take you through to writing to your own MP. Just put in your postcode and you can write to them explaining about the tier 1 and 2 threats, the wrong prioritisation to meet our security needs. Wash your hands of Trident. That's a very simple thing to do. And then, of course, there's writing to your local newspapers about that as well, raising it wherever you can. If you're having online trade union meetings, maybe at the moment, lots of online Zoom stuff going on, Skype things, raise it in any of those kind of fora as well. It occurs to me also that we have a new leadership of the Labour Party, a new shadow cabinet. So I think it would be well worth people writing to the leader of the Labour Party, but also to the shadow defence secretary, raising the question of these strategic defence priorities, and the threats and the money allocated to them. Because if they're going to be looking perhaps at their own sort of shadow strategic defence review, there's obviously going to be a government one going on later this year, we think. If they're going to be looking at what they're posing, what they want to say to the government, let's put it in their minds to raise this whole question, because as the opposition, they're there, at least in part, to make the government accountable, to be asking the difficult questions and saying, well, look, why did you spend all this money on something that's pretty much irrelevant, and why haven't you been spending it on the health service? So I think writing to those new figures, and when people come into new jobs, they should be listening, and I think we should assume that they will be listening and wanting to develop new policies, because you can't go on with the old policies in this situation. I think that's an important thing to do. And then one of the other things to do locally, I know that Manchester Council is very good on this issue. This is the question of being a local authority against nuclear weapons. There's an initiative at the moment going on globally to get local authorities, mayors and so on, to sign up to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or to say that they support it. Our government's against it. This is the also called the Nuclear Ban Treaty. Our government won't support it, but lots of towns, cities, councils, regional, rural authorities are saying, yeah, actually, that makes sense. We want to support it. So if you're in a situation where you can't go out on the street with your stall or giving out your leaflets, why not write a letter to your mayor or to your local councillors and say, what about getting this discussed in a council meeting? So you can take those local initiatives forward. So there's loads of scope. There's definitely loads of scope for action.
There is, and interestingly, on that note, I'm going to be talking to Sean Morris from the Nuclear Free Local Authorities Secretariat in Manchester, that is based in Manchester, and he's also working very hard on with Mayors for Peace as well, with his other hat on. So I'm going to be talking to Sean, and Sean's going to be helping people to navigate the whole process and the best way of getting in touch with the councils, and whether to go through the mayor or to the chief executive's office or through specific councillors, etc., etc. So Sean and I will be chatting about that next week. I think we're doing that next week, so that'll be hopefully make it nice and easy. Show the easy process it is. Yes. So that was very timely, Kate. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Right, well, I think that's it for now, and thank you ever so much. It was great speaking with you, and great to hear what National CND is doing. And maybe we could do this again, and we could focus on another topic. I think that would be really helpful to all of us that are still out there campaigning against nuclear weapons in our local communities, and actually beyond, because obviously now the nice thing is we're doing this in our local communities, but because we're doing this sort of this online work, it seems to be spreading much further, which is a good thing.
International people in as well, because it doesn't cost anything. Get an American person on the line from the peace movement over there, see how they're dealing with the lockdown and so on. It's perfect for having those dialogues.
Yes, well, I think we're going to have a whole series of these talks, and I think we'll continue into the future. So thank you very much, Kate Hudson from the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament.
Thanks for inviting me.
And stay safe and we'll talk soon. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Jacqui.
Thank you.